And then the actress said to the bishop,
Oh. Good man. Oh, what happened was that, for those that don't know, that's a reference to Jethro, a famous English comedian of high note and regard, who sadly died, I think, last year. But anyway, hello everybody. We're here with Ukrainian Bruce, Craig Lippett, who we've not seen for a few years. We're going to catch up with Craig, find out what he's doing, and we won't bother talking to Mark because he hasn't got any idea at all anymore. So let's start with Bruce. This pushback thing. What's happening with pushback in 2023?
Well, people are getting all riled up. It's actually quite good. And this morning, I got a response from the FAA to my latest query. I haven't even read it yet. It just popped into my intro. So I'll read that when I've finished here, priorities. And we'll see what they've got to say, see how things are going, because we have to hold their feet to the flames. But they're pretty busy right now, the FAA. They've got a lot on their plate, a lot of problems over in America, isn't there? JFK airliners crashing into each other. Where was that other event? Was that in Tibia, some airfield? Remember, was it in the islands, Caribbean or something, when the two airliners collided in the 70s? It was almost like Tenerife. Yeah, it was almost like that. And my point is, it hasn't got a lot of coverage in the media. It's not like front page headlines everywhere. But imagine if that had been a drone and not another airliner. It would have been all over the media. It would have been saturated with, Mavic 2 endangers airliner full of people. But when it's another airliner crossing across the runway, imagine if the air traffic controller had been a second later in calling off that takeoff. Imagine what would have happened.
Well, it harks back a little bit to what we've spoken about before, in that, technology has moved on. Craig is an Air Force air traffic controller. I think you're still a reservist now, are you, Craig? I don't know quite where you're at there. But I don't think the technology has dramatically changed in 30 years, really. Yes, it's changed, but not dramatically. But you would have thought by now there would have been all sorts of systems in place. They would have put the brakes on the jet or done whatever, screamed out loudly to
remote ID would have solved that.
Would have solved everything, solved absolutely everything. But yeah, it strikes me that we are. Is Bruce in a prison jumpsuit? We can only hope. I would have thought that sort of thing would be possible to alert now, ground warning radar systems and all that sort of a thing. It's a little bit mystifying that could still happen. I don't know. You'll have a better insight on that than me, Craig.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I was listening to Radio 4 tonight about this, and it was being covered in some depth, actually, and there's some interesting points to it. But Bruce has got an interesting, he makes an interesting observation, as in, air traffic control has evolved, but there are still basic procedures and technologies in place which, seek to prevent this. But this actually happens a lot more than you realise around the world. It isn't just in the States. It's a problem everywhere. It's one of the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK's Significant 7, which is basically a runway incursion. So as an aircraft is using a runway, something else will enter that runway space. So it does happen quite often. There are measures to try and prevent or to reduce the amount of time that happens. But in this case, it was not a problem. The air traffic controller identified it. And, some things like JFK, for instance, I know that they've got, like at Heathrow, they've got a ground radar, which is able to see the aircraft moving around the maneuvering area at any particular time. And the controller was able to recognize that I think it was the American Airlines or United Airlines flight was crossing in front of the Delta Airlines as it was beginning its takeoff roll. So disaster averted, but we've seen from recently there was an event which sadly was fatal it was down in South America, where now a fire vehicle crossed in front of it and collided with one wing. 2 firefighters were sadly killed. I don't think anyone on the plane was killed, but I think it illustrates the point. If that were to be a drone, then Bruce absolutely, his point is real valid. It would be front page news. There's no question about it. And now I'm not suggesting that sort of thing happens at the same frequency as potential airliner conflictions on airfields, but only has to happen once. We only have to be unlucky once, and then all of a sudden, all of us in the drone industry are in a different reality, because we're suddenly front and center in people's minds that we're operating bits of technology that are unsafe, which is not the case at all. So yeah, it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the police in the UK crashed a drone into a house, and the media jumped on that. That got far more attention than it deserved, because I think it was only a Mavic 2 or something, a Mini 2 or something.
Yeah.
It was only it wasn't a threat to anybody, but the media jumped on that. Yet when we had the airliner incident in JFK, it was kind of played down, I think, below the potential for danger really was. So we still have this media bias, a huge media bias, and part of Pushback 2023 is educating the media, educating the public about drones, because they've been so misinformed about everything. And it's interesting to note that Amazon and Google are suffering from this now, because people with drone deliveries, people are complaining, we don't want the intrusion, we don't want the noise, we don't want the danger. So, they are actually now suffering the same as the hobby, because this whole phobia about drones has become so profound in the public consciousness. It needs to be changed.
Did you see the Amazon court case? I can't remember the name of the chap that worked for them and left under a cloud, and now he's revealing all the accidents they've been having and all the testing that wasn't happening. So that's quite interesting. Personally, I think that Amazon thing's been a fail from day one. But that's
Amazon's only there to justify their UTM, the same as Google. They're only there so they can justify UTM and selling UTM services to governments. That's the raison d'etre. None of them, they don't have any interest in drone delivery as a service, because it's never going to be economically viable in their lifetimes.
I had to drive down to Durban on Monday on the highway, which I very, very rarely drive on the highway, and I very, very rarely drive by myself. Normally, the
usually on the footpath, aren't you?
Sorry?
Usually drive on the footpath, don't you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So but when I went down there, so because I haven't driven, say, in the car by myself for years on the highway, so normally with the family, I had time to actually look at it and think about it in a drone delivery context, in that all these vehicles are moving and stuff going everywhere, and it just made me think, oh wow, this level of traffic, if this were drones and everyone was like this, but there was some form of order, it actually wouldn't be that bad. And then you look at the width of the highway and you think, wow, if it was 3 or 4 times the width of this, and some vertical stuff as well, you really could stuff the sky with drones, as is in all images you ever see in the newspaper. It sort of, I don't know, gave me a little bit of clarity about the whole thing. It'd be a lot easier than people are moaning about. But the bottom line is, for these small packages to your home, I don't think there's ever going to be a use case. I really. But
also, look at it. You can drive down the motorway when it's raining. You can drive down the motorway when it's really windy. If there's snow, whereas drone delivery has a much narrower envelope of operation, which compromises its availability it severely compromises the economics. Imagine if the motorway was closed every time it rained or snowed or windy. Even delivering stuff by van would become marginally economic.
Plus, then you've got to have an aircraft that's certified, the expense of that. So it'll cost, these things are going to cost the same as a car nearly. So, if you've got a 40 grand bit of kit that you can't use every day, day in, day out, like kind of delivery van, it's what's the point in it? Because it'll have to be certified. It's going to have to be rigorously tested. It'll have a lifespan that people will radically undervalue. So they'll say, oh, it's only got a 5-year frame lifespan, or so many hours, and they'll just completely wipe themselves out the market price-wise, which is just where it's going to go. For last minute, it's just not the solution, really.
There's a very good reason why Google doesn't charge for its deliveries. No one could afford to pay what it was actually costing.
Absolutely, and that's to say, we've delivered 100,000 parcels. Well, that's great. You've done it for free. If you said to that end user, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you 25 quid for that can of Coke or whatever, a cup of coffee or whatever it is, they're going to be saying no. They're definitely going to be saying no. But anyway, I think we're pretty preaching to the converted here, aren't we?
And we've had drones falling on canoes and races, and there's been a lot of things happening in the drone arena in the last week or so.
Sorry, Craig, you were going to.
Yeah, I think, all those points are valid. I completely agree with them about the viability of a drone delivery business model. But nevertheless, there's still lots of companies who are in startup phase, moving up into scale-up phase, attracting investment. Companies like Manor, who are originally from Ireland, and Skyports got a reasonable amount of traction in a number of areas, not just the vertical idea with eVTOL, but there's lots of interest in drone delivery because that is perceived to be what consumers want. Now, the mechanics of actually delivering on that is, and I use that as a pun, deliberately, is a real challenge, and the public don't see the challenges that are behind it. What they want is the end effect. They want the outcome. But the public perception's being sort of affected all the time, and as you pointed out, it'll be dropped quickly if the public's, and it seems to be happening as well, if the public decide that actually it's not as cool as I thought it was going to be, and I can get the same effect achieved through slightly longer, turnaround time of an hour of my pizza rather than 15 minutes. That's something I can accept.
That perception has been created. It's an illusion. It's not reality. It's an illusion that these things are going to happen. So that there's people carefully crafting a narrative which creates that perception within the realms of the public. And this is my big gripe with the drone industry. It creates an unrealistic expectation, and that's why I say part of pushback is educating to people as to what is possible, what is practical. And this, for example, the whole drone spying thing. You see a drone as a little white dot in the distance, it's spying on me, because a lot of these people have never actually seen what comes out the camera of a Mavic Mini or whatever. You can't identify faces from more than a couple hundred meters. So if the drone is a little speck in the sky, it's not spying on you. We need to make people aware that they have actually been misinformed by the media over a long period of time.
And let's face it, CCTV in cities, especially the UK cities, there's just so, you're watched all the time, so you'll see it a lot more. And last mile delivery, quite clearly, the Starship units that are running around in the UK, in Leeds, is it Leeds in Sheffield?
Bradford.
Those are where last minute delivery is, because a drone cannot deliver to a block of flats, for example. Where's it going to land? So it automatically has a problem getting to certain properties, certain gardens won't be suitable for the delivery. Where these little Starships, you can literally go to the end of your footpath and just go, bring me it here. It will come to that point for you and tell you it's arrived. That's last minute. Don't get me wrong, drone freight to islands or stuff like that, I think, is the right way to do it. If you want to shift stuff point to point, from warehouse to warehouse, point to point, that's where drones are, and then it will turn into ground vehicle. And I would say in the next 20 years, when we get automated cars properly, maybe 30 years, it'll become a van. You'll get an Amazon wagon. It will come down your street. It will text you and say you're outside. You'll walk out to it. There'll be no driver in it, but it'll deliver the parcel to you there. You'll get to the hatch with your app. It'll open. You take your parcel. That's it. So all these things have a finite lifespan, if you like. I don't think proper drone deliveries. Yeah, it'd be hub. It'd be hub and spoke. It's not going to be door to door at all. I don't think it'd be more delivery vans, Amazon style eventually. But that's 20 years down the road, I think.
I wonder how many companies have gone to. I can't think of UK van delivery, some big UK delivery van chain, and said, "What's the hardest thing for you to deliver, and where, and how would it work for you?" Rather than approaching it from the good old Silicon Valley mindset of build it and they will come, which is what this industry has been doing really for 10 years, making all sorts of stuff that nobody actually wanted. Then somebody must surely have asked Tesco's or whatever, what do they really need? But it does. I'll swing this around a little bit. I'll bring it onto the batteries thing, as Bruce mentioned it earlier. I was quite shocked at the battery in that I've forgotten the name of the thing being onto pins onto a plate. I was really quite shocked that got anywhere, or was a thing you could buy. I mean, I don't know, Bruce, you'll know far better than me. What would your battery connection recommended ultimate perfect way of doing it be?
Oh, wireless, of course.
Wireless. Big cord, yeah.
I don't know. I got nothing.
Oh, I thought you'd have a fantastic engineering answer for that. You get.
What are you talking about? Battery connection to what?
Well, just to the aircraft. Just pushing it into the aircraft. So that was a battery that slotted in, and it was
Yeah,
pins off a flat plate. And that to me is, if you knock it down, you're going to get shorting. You're going to give the battery bounces. You're going to get
that's a whole engineering. It's a whole engineering issue in its own, isn't it? I mean, if you're talking about drones, one of the problems with having the battery as not a structural member is it adds weight. If you want to make it removable, then you have to build structural strength around the battery. You can't use the battery necessarily as a structural member. So that adds weight, reduces payload, reduces endurance. But there are so many engineering issues when you want to create a commercially viable drone, and we just don't have solutions for them yet.
Well, I think there's certainly DJI batteries are quite tidy. The bigger ones have got micro switches to know that they've been pushed home hard enough. As you say, engineering solutions. But I'm a little bit surprised that the Civil Aviation Authority let that one through like that. If a layman like me looks at it and goes, "Ooh, that looks a bit iffy," surely they're engineering people. And then the regime, the safety regime of operating, much like, again, the thing that went into the Thames. What did the guy say? Oh no, I bring it back at 15% battery or something like that. That's what? I don't know.
But that's the problem.
Maybe
the people writing the rules haven't done this stuff, right? The people telling us how to fly our drones and so forth safely, and the margins for tolerance and things. They're working from a book or from third-hand information. They don't do this themselves, so they rely on the operator to fill in the gaps. So I don't see why there should be such prescriptive measures when the people writing the prescription are not expert in the field. They should be writing aspirational goals or goals compliance, performance goals, and then leave the solution up to the person that knows what they're doing to meet those goals. There's too much micromanagement in the regulatory framework.
No, this is we must address David's look at this here. So he's had a battery blown involved twice, motor failure on flights to Scotland. Yeah. Triggers, are they the triggers to stop the overflight thing? Well, I think the overflight thing is big trouble for the UK.
No, I don't think they are, because the CA's had this coming for a while. And the problem is, if they was to turn around and say, okay, so drones can't overfly because of this risk. Remember, no one's been killed or seriously injured from a drone falling and hitting them yet, because actually direct overflight isn't the problem. If a drone fails and it's directly above you and it's in transit, you're the safest person if you're under it, because it will just go over you in an arc. So that's the interesting bit. However, the problem is, I think that if they did that, we could then go to them. What about the plane that clipped that Arctic when it was coming into land? Why do you allow planes and other aircraft to come over houses and roads to come into land when clearly aviation can do it safely? We can. I mean,
what's the death toll associated with manned aircraft crashing into suburban areas and other populated areas? It is infinitely higher than the death toll associated with drones falling from the sky, recreational drones and commercial drones falling from the sky, because the risk profiles are different, and we've proven that manned aviation poses a risk. So we want to forbid a lower risk craft from doing something that we allow high risk craft to do every day. It does not make sense.
Exactly.
Well, that Nepal thing. That Nepal thing could have been a lot less terrible as it was. Could have been a lot worse, couldn't it? A lot worse.
I mean, don't get me wrong, right? When I first started out, we had the DJI work on the A2, and occasionally, and I was reminded of this the other day online. Those would get compass issues, and they would actually try to fly back. They get their compass error, and they wanted to go back to China, and back then, we had, the aircrafts were not as good as they are today. Let's be honest. Today, if you've got something like the M300 or the Mavic Pro 2, even the Phantom 4 Pro, although old, those machines are very robust and very solid. They don't typically have that many errors. Yes, you can sometimes a prop might come off because it's not been attached correctly. That's probably pilot error. You're always going to get the odd pilot error, but it doesn't mean that you should suddenly say, stop overflight. It's just not reasonable at all to remove the bubble.
There's going to be a big conflict too with this eVTOL AAM, because they're all going to be flying over highly populated areas with no fallback system. If the power system fails totally, or if you get failure of two motors or something, or a motor, there's no fallback. You might have a ballistic parachute that'll just cover the corpses and the wreckage because you're flying too low. It's they look at us and say, "Oh, it's too dangerous," but then they're going to be allowing all this much more dangerous stuff. It doesn't make any sense, doesn't it?
They're not going to be allowing it because it's not going to exist.
Urban air mobility to go over cities would be, if they turn around and took away drones, bubble flying, but flying the bubble instead of cylinder, you'd have to go, okay, urban air mobility. You're right. Show us the safety profile and risk of that thing. I'd rather be in a I've been in a helicopter. I'd rather be in a helicopter that has a failure than one of these eVTOLs that has a failure, because that helicopter pilot, at least if they're good, has a chance of an auto to get it down. Those urban air mobility eVTOLs. Whew.
I think
it's the one for the CAA, David. Who knows? It's crazy. If they do it, remember, we're still not 100% sure if it's going to happen. It's a lot of rumours at the minute, but the wording is they are looking at it. And it also becomes interesting if it adversely affects all PDRA1 operators. Could we sue the CA for taking away something we've had for over 10 years now? That would be interesting.
On the subject of UAM, we probably need to be clear on this. The only way it's going to happen in an urban environment for aircraft of a sufficient size to perhaps carry passengers is on a full certified basis, because there's no other alternative. That's the only pathway. And if you look at operators, or sorry, they're not operators, manufacturers, not necessarily OEMs, but integrators like Vertical Aerospace based in Bristol,
I was going to mention that.
Building a VX4, that is UAM, but it's not unmanned yet. They're building their first VX4 is test flown, I understand, and it's flown by test pilots. These are helicopter pilots of some note, test pilot graduates from Boscombe Down, ex-military, and it's been done on the basis that they fully expect to be able to fly in an urban environment only under the conditions of a certified manned aircraft, because there's no other way to do it at the moment. The regulators are trying to develop that in the future, but that's going to take some time. And if you look at the UKCA, they've got no real clarity about what the certified status is going to look like. There's some in the specific area, and in the organisation that I've just left, we've been building an aircraft to the specific 2 category, because our aircraft was 300 to 400 kilograms maximum takeoff mass, a middle mile delivery system, and it was going to have to fly to a degree over people at some stage, and there were all sorts of measures that were being designed into the system. The smaller systems, I completely understand, about overflight. I'm a bit confused about the sudden changes, but that I think is the distinction between the different sizes and what the use cases are. Because there's a crawl, walk, run approach that we're going to have to adopt, and a lot of people think that it's a condensed timeline, but it's not. It's going to take a long time to develop that, because there's too many moving parts in the industry.
I think they're beginning to unthink that it's condensed now.
It is worth pointing out that YASA and others have said, although they wanted all these automated UAMs to begin with, they actually turned around and said, no, we actually want a pilot in there. So YASA and others have said, no, your first UAM vehicles will be piloted. So not only does it have to carry 4 people, for example, it also has to carry the 5th, the pilot, which 100 kilos is if it's 100 kilos of weight you've got to carry extra being that person. The battery's got to be bigger. It's just reality, and it's just one of those things for now.
And the economics of these AAM, UAM are based on the fact you don't need a pilot. That's where they claim they have the savings. You don't have someone with epaulets costing you so much an hour. Therefore, it becomes economically viable. But if you have to have a pilot in there, that just blows that out of the water.
But they've got to arrive at that point, and as Craig says, that will be via a certified flown aircraft. You don't just arrive at an autonomous system that everybody loves. And that VX4 is a very, very nice looking machine. I believe Mr. Walters blagged himself a trip and a go in the sim or something like that, because that's the sort of person he is. He's a blagger.
So will we have full self-driving cars before we have UAM?
I think to a degree it's a bit easier in the sky because there's less things to hit.
Except for all those damn drones and birds.
Yes. But I don't think, I really don't think that is the threat. And we've had UAM since the 50s. It's helicopters, isn't it? We've had it, and it hasn't got mad. There's loads of other reasons, but bullets, bandages, beans, that's just the sort of, I think, kind of machine. The big machine you have is a parafoil, Craig, wasn't it? It was a flying power parachute. Is that the one we're thinking about? But that sort of thing, that bullets, bandages, and beans, there's going to be a need for that, and that's going to drive Craig's former company's machine, and it's going to drive several delivery drones that hit into that market. I could see that coming quite soon, operating under military authority, MAAA, whatever it is, and that will be somewhat easier to get there, and that will prove the case for deliveries of 100, 200 kilos to small regional aircraft. Airfields, but I think Hannah Reich. Why do I think of Hannah Reich test piloting the V1? Did she? I don't think she did.
She test piloted a number of craft, but the V1 was unmanned. They did make a manned version of it though later on.
Well, maybe she test flew it then. Or better Google that then, didn't I?
She's more famous for 163 flying, isn't she?
Yes, and of course the helicopter indoors. Before the Second World War, wasn't that twin?
How would you test fly that manned one? Because it was a suicide plane, wasn't it?
No, she did.
Only got one flight.
She did fly. Oh, the 263. Yeah, she jolly well did.
A pulse jet powered one.
I'll be with standby caller. I'll be with you shortly. V1 on the 28th of February 1944. She presented the idea of Operation Suicide to Hitler. Yeah. They turn it into a suicide one. Yeah. Right.
So you wouldn't want to be the test pilot for that, because if it was a success, you'd be dead.
Yeah, they adapted the V1 into a two-seater and a single-seater with and without mechanisms to land. After her initial 2 crashes, wow. Yeah, wow. She was pretty amazing, wasn't she? Wow. Gosh. That was been exciting. Right. Let me catch up with it. Oh, everyone's saying hello to Dave. That's terrible. We won't let that continue. And the 262. That's right. And I'd like to know what bubble Geeks is talking about that he's seen popping there. And quads flying on 3 motors. Well, then tricopters then, aren't they? But yeah, that has happened.
No, they're actually little bent, twisted wrecks on the ground.
Well, yeah, but it can happen. But you've got to get some.
You've got to spin it around. But controller's marginal, isn't it?
Yeah,
and I've seen that. Yeah. I've seen cases where it works, and a lot more cases where it doesn't work. Because if you're too slow and detecting, and it gets upside down, you've got no recovery mode.
Now, Craig, what exciting news have you got from the drone world to tell us? It's very interesting to have you here, and I want to know why.
Thank you for having me on. And you did mention about we're going to talk about the recent case with a drone operator operating illegally in Derbyshire during a Battle of Britain memorial fly past, which I thought was an interesting case, and one that has, I think, perhaps some interesting reverberations for us in the industry. I think what's interesting about it is that some things that I learned was that the Derbyshire Constabulary have got a flight safety manager who's a policeman who's trained, which was an interesting thing. I'm not sure if that is repeated around all the police forces in the country, but it's an interesting move because I come from a safety background. As Dave has just pointed out, I'm doing a master's degree at Cranfield University on air safety management, risk and regulation. So that was an interesting point. I personally think it's a good move to identify and prosecute drone operators like this, because I think you have to be able to show that justice is being done. And I understand that the perpetrator has pleaded guilty and will be sentenced in February. It'd be interesting to see what that sentence is. I don't know what the law states in terms of what that sentence will be. I don't think it's probably. I'm not sure if it's reached the threshold of a custodial sentence or whether it's just a fine or something like that. But I'd be interested to see what that is. What I can say is that the aircraft involved was a Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Hurricane from World War II. And 3 years ago, I had the privilege of being able to sit in a World War II vintage Hurricane. And I learned two things. The first one was that it wasn't designed for somebody of my frame. I'm 6'3" and about 16.5 stone. It was designed for World War II pilots who were literally half my size. But the other thing more relevant was that the view through the canopy, particularly through the front, and bearing in mind all the metalwork that is on the sliding canopy of the Hurricane, meant that the view for the pilot must have been really restricted. So I don't know how close the drone came to the actual Hurricane itself during the flight path, but it must have been really difficult for the pilot to see if he saw it at all.
I don't think he did.
They say he didn't see it.
No,
but even with good visibility, that seeing a small object against background clutter is just about impossible. It's at that sort of speed.
Yeah, and it's a £3 million aircraft valued of historical significance, and more importantly, if it had hit bearing in mind it was at an air show, if it had hit the Hurricane, then any number of risk outcomes could have happened.
But to be fair, the Hurricane did have guns, the drone didn't.
Yeah, yeah, it was
a score intercept, and yeah.
But
here's sorry.
Going after you, Mark.
Well, I'm going to be the controversial one, maybe. If the drone pilot, although the aircraft couldn't see the drone, okay, so we now know that's true. The aircraft, the pilot couldn't see the drone. He was flying as he was flying. Does it mean the drone pilot was unsafe because he was close to it? If he was watching and observing, because an aircraft always flies forwards, a plane is flying forwards.
But I think you knock that. But I'm going to stop you there because you could knock it on the head because he was in a no-tanned area. So he shouldn't have been flying.
It's right. So the no-tan is what made it unsafe, is what you're saying.
No, the no-tan didn't make it unsafe, but it meant that he shouldn't.
He shouldn't have
been flying there. It does. It didn't make it unsafe. What made it unsafe?
Made it illegal.
Made it illegal, or made it unsafe.
That gave him the right
the wing tip of the Hurricane. I don't know. Craig's more qualified than me to speak to what makes it unsafe.
Yeah, the problem is, at what point is too close to another aircraft? Don't get me wrong, right? Some people go within 500 feet is too close to another aircraft. Within 1,000 feet, what is the actual separation to an aircraft?
Well, before I let Craig answer, if you are not in contact. If I'm taking words out of his mouth, probably not. He'll probably kind of come up with a better answer than me now. But I can tell you is if you practice formation flying with someone who doesn't know that you want to be practicing formation flying with them, then you have no agreement. So there was no agreement for what was happening between the two pilots. So too close is whatever that other pilot deems it to be.
But he didn't know. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm just being the bad person here. You know, I'm saying the pilot, the aircraft never saw him. So if that video had never been shown to anyone, right, and no one had ever seen it, and the Hurricane pilot never saw it, would it have been considered unsafe if you never saw the footage?
Well, that's a tree falling in the wood, isn't it? With no one around. Does it make a sound? That
is my kind. And don't get me wrong, right? I know it was dangerous, right? And I would consider it would be dangerous and wrong. However, the guy had kind of, it is kind of an unserved argument. It is, I'm being the bad person. You know, I'm being the bad person here. I'm just, making sure that everyone understands this is the bad person trying to argue with the nice people. So you're already going, no, and this is why. So I'm just making sure everyone is clear and understands that my debate is wrong. And
There's always one. There's always one.
I think you're
exactly.
I think Mark, you're just being devil's avocado, as I called it before. But which is a useful position to be in for a conversation like this, because I think most of us are all on the same view. But just to provide a little bit of context to this, from an air traffic control perspective, whilst there was a NOTAM in place and the air show, I believe, was happening in what's called visual Met conditions. So the flight was happening under visual flight rules. which essentially means see and be seen. So the pilots are required to maintain visual contact with other aircraft outside, which technically includes drones. There is a ruling in the UK. I'm not quite sure how. I'm assuming it's the same across the globe under ICAO regulations, but in the UK, if you come close to another aircraft, you come under what's called air proximity rules, which which is abbreviated to airprox. And the definition of an airprox, I'm trying to remember this from my ground school examination from way back in '99, is where the relative speed and trajectory of two aircraft are such that one or more of the aircraft have deemed to be, and there has been a risk to the occupants of that aircraft that is deemed to be considered a risk. Not exactly the definition, but broadly speaking. So in other words, one pilot can report the aircraft as being a risk, and the other one may consider it not to be a risk, because in their view, well, I was miles away and I was going in a different direction. And you can also report an airprox. Bearing in mind that not many airproxes have been reported between drones and aircraft. That's not to say that they're not on the increase, and air proximity reports, when they are submitted, will actually be investigated by a formed body in the aviation industry, which look into it, and then they come up with a report. If they've got access to the drone operator, they'll interview the drone operator. If they've got access to the pilot, they'll do the same, try and establish where the aircraft were relative to each other and how the sort of sequence of things played out, just to try and determine whether it was a risk. Because to come back to your point, it may be that the drone operator got airborne and thought, because of my, the perception of where the drone is relative to the flight past line, I'm perfectly safe. But then he's not in contact with the Hurricane pilot and doesn't understand what the aircraft might be doing in terms of its plans, and therefore can't adjust accordingly because they're not speaking to each other. And therefore, the Hurricane might have turned at a particular point, come into his line where he was, and all of a sudden you have a dangerous situation. But you're right. He could have, if the circumstances of that had happened slightly differently and the Hurricane had turned left instead of right, this wouldn't even be in the news. It wouldn't even be an issue.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting as well about airprox reality? So airproxes, please, everyone, go and see airprox reality check, because the people that do the airprox checks by the CAA, they don't study it all as far as I'm concerned, they don't study airprox checks correctly. You need to go and check out airprox reality check, and they actually look at the data a lot better, I think. And you can see where people have reported a drone, but actually it looks like it's a helicopter or another aircraft being reported so far out, but their perception is it's something small and white, therefore it's a drone.
Didn't BALPA tell its members that all unconfirmed sightings of things they can't identify are now to be reported as drones?
Yeah,
yes,
not UFO.
UFO as well, which we all know. It should be all UFO. But airprox reality check, it's a website. Go check it out, and you'll see about all the UK airproxes regarding drones for the last few years. And you'll see most of them are just twaddle. Most of them.
Well, but to defend them a little bit, I've been reading airprox reports for 30, 40 years, something like that. They haven't had a situation where the press would take that report quite as much as they have done since the drone era, particularly since Gatwick, and just send it out as facts. So I think the airprox people have been a little bit naive in the modern world of how they communicate stuff. It's not their fault, because these been going. Craig will remember there was like one every month, wasn't there? There was a magazine with them
UFOs
from all over the place.
UFOs. The biggest problem is, unless you can actually got a photo of it or some sort of solid proof, it's a UFO, and that's what everything should be reported as, not just an airprox. It's just it's just crazy.
So what's this overflight thing? I'm not up to speed on this. Are CA looking at banning all overflights, are they?
Yes. So in the UK currently, we have the bubble. So your aircraft's in a bubble, and it's 50 meters around it under your CA operational authorization. Unless you're landing and taking off, then it's reduced to 30 meters. But basically, it means I can literally take off my from somewhere. I can overfly a road safely because I do all my pre-flight checks and everything. I could overfly footpaths, houses, anything. I could cruise at 400 feet around quite nicely, not interfere with anyone. However, yes, but they're going to change it. And what's going to become is a cylinder. So instead of being the bubble as we fly around, it's now going to be a cylinder in directions. But depending what height you're flying at, that cylinder will grow or shrink to a degree.
So it's a truncated cone.
It's going to get daft, Bruce, because it looks like they're taking the A2CFC 1-to-1 BS, which I don't like, and they're kind of adapting it to cylinder flying for the GVC-PDRA01. And there's no safety reason for this. There's no
Well, hang on a minute. I have to interrupt because if it was a bubble before, that meant if you were flying higher than 50 feet, you could fly over people, right?
Over 50 meters.
50 meters, yeah. So what they're saying is a drone falling from 50 meters is much less likely to kill you than one falling from 10. That makes no sense.
Terminal velocity. That's all I'm going to say. Once something reaches terminal velocity, that's
it's not going to reach terminal velocity in 50 meters, is it?
50 meters. No.
Nowhere near it.
There is a thing that where you can calculate that.
It's 10 meters per second is the acceleration of gravity, and the terminal velocity of a drone falling is probably going to be close enough to like 100 miles an hour. So that's going to take more than 50 meters.
Yeah. But so if you're flying at 52 meters, so you fly actually at 52 meters. To overfly a person, you'd actually fly at 52 or 60 meters because obviously a person could be 2 meters tall. So you've got to be 50 meters.
9-meter man.
But to be fair, I don't actually, I'm the outlaw and the renegade. I don't actually have a problem with not overflying people because that's one thing that I choose not to do, regardless of what I'm flying, because I know how badly things can go wrong very quickly, and I simply always avoid flying over people or their property that I can't afford to replace because it's just common sense to me. I don't see why, unless you really, really have to, and this is an absolute reason to do so, why you don't avoid people and their expensive property.
Well, the thing is, it's like a helicopter flying. So we were, and Craig might do it because you used to work for the opposition to Euro USC at the time. The thing with the bubble is we were told we're treated like aircraft. So we will be treated like manned aviation or similar. And the thing is, now people go direct overflight. It's not unsafe. The bit that the worst place to be when an aircraft fails is not under it. If a drone fails and you're still under it, that's probably the safest place because it's in.
Yeah, but as you fly towards those people, if your drone fails, you're going to crash into them. My path forward and back never passes over people. I go to the side of them so that even if I do have a failure, it's going to, at the very worst, crash beside them, not either in front of them, behind them, or on top of them.
So Graham was referring to assemblies of people. I think, they've changed the wording maybe, but wasn't it in Cat 72H that depending upon what height you're flying, that cylinder gets wider or smaller? Or I could be wrong, but I'm sure Graham will tell us in a minute.
That looks like a good answer. That looks like a good answer there. And this one, probably not. Oh yeah, yours modified version being accelerated through this consultation coming soon. So David, if it's that far out from what that is this actually going to be a thing? What am I trying to say here? Do you believe, David, that this modification is going to happen, or are we going to sort of getting rid of the bubble, or are we just
they're going to destroy the UK drone industry in one good go? The PDRA01 holders will just collapse because there'll be no point to holding PDRA01. They'll all switch to the A2CFC. The stakeholders slides that you've seen, Gary, they were already a lie, saying 7,000 CA operational authorization holders. That was already a big lie. We know that because it's only 3,500 operators. That number will cascade to fail, I predict. So that'll just do this because everyone will just go, I'm just going to fly in the A2CFC. It's just crazy.
Just to address Dovoran's comment there about crewed aircraft do have overflight restrictions. They have minimum altitudes to allow a vehicle to
which is what we do.
Yeah, and a 172 or something like that. Yeah, if your engine fails, you can glide to a safe area. I've yet to see a hexacopter glide.
Well, helicopters still keep flying, in my experience.
Well, no, if you have like but if you have like a power system failure, or in a quadcopter you have a single motor failure, they just don't glide. They just fall out of the sky. So it's slightly different to a manned aircraft, like a helicopter has auto rotation, which generally is done in a forward direction. You have some direction you can travel in with a degree of control, but not with a multi-rotor.
But so here's another point then. So do we all remember the M210 issues? So the DJI M210 in the UK was falling out of the sky left, right, and centre because it was water ingress or where it wasn't tested, quite right. And as soon as they start to happen, all the reports were going to the CAA from the police and the fire departments, not from normal operators so much, but it was mostly the police and fire. And all of a sudden, we got that ban on that aircraft overflying. Do we know in the UK? We got that notification very quickly. You cannot fly this until they sort out the battery issues. It was battery voltage issues as well, wasn't it? And they said, right, no overflight, which made perfect sense for that aircraft at that time. As if something was spotted that was causing a problem, and right, no overflight. These aircraft we fly today are so safe. It's the one for one. It's not for assemblies of people. The A2C of 1-to-1 is not for assemblies of people. Unless they're talking about the new assemblies of people under PDRA 01, they're going to make it 1-to-1, which is a bit of a joke because under the A2CFC at 50 meters, you can be 400 feet high and 50 meters away. And yet
the great
PDRA
thing about all of this, Mark, is and it really must help with flight safety, is all of this is so simple to understand that any child could easily pick up and be able to understand his rights, roles, and responsibilities when flying. And that surely is where we should loop this conversation around to. Is it's all very well having lots of things and lots of words in a book, but you need something that you can clearly carry out and understand when you are in the field without thinking, is it Thursday? Am I A2 CFC or PDR A01 because the wind's south-southwest by 5 knots? I'm just trying to say the complexity in all this is making things dangerous, in my humble opinion.
Exactly. We've reached peak drone regulation. When the CAA doesn't know what its own rules are saying to the extent they contradict themselves, and when the FAA doesn't know how to interpret its own rules, so it just simply ignores you, these things indicate that the regulations have reached a point where it is impossible for the people affected by regulation to comply because the regulator can't tell them what the rules are anymore. They're too complicated and contrived and twisted. So we need to back right off from this, as I said, micromanagement, telling us exactly how to do things safely. No, just tell us we must do things safely, provide some advisory information, but say there are, as I've said many, many times, there are 2 primary rules. Do not endanger other people, do not endanger other people's property, and everything else becomes advisory. You can't forget those 2 rules. If you can't remember those 2 rules, you shouldn't be getting out of bed in the morning because you're not competent to walk. So we just need to have those rules, and then just, again, ultimately, that's what it boils down to anyway, because people will choose which rules they want to obey, if any of them, based on their own working out of what the risks are. So it's all about teaching people to identify and manage risk. Give them the skills. What does it say? You give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish. You feed him for a lifetime. If we just prescriptively roll out this micromanagement, it's going to be like giving man a fish. As soon as he encounters something he doesn't understand and the regulations don't cover, he's stuffed. And we've seen instances where people have done things 100% compliant with the regulations and disasters have happened because they're not taught to think outside those regulations. They use them as a crutch rather than using them as an aid to make good risk management decisions. We're not taking the right path anymore.
So here's a quick question to Craig, because Craig's been around a long time in the industry. Do you remember 166 and 167?
Yeah.
Do you think, and Cap 722 back then as well, because there was Cap 722 at the time. It's been around for a long time. Do you think the rules have got better since those two have gone and the Cap 722 has moved on? Do you think the rules are now better or worse? Not just also in complications. Do you think has the improvement been in ease of understanding the rules for the betterment of the industry?
That is a really good question. One that I've not really had time to consider, but as an immediate response, what has been evident is that there's been an evolution there's a cyclical, if that's the word, evolution of regulation. So a lot of it is dependent on who's in the CAA at the time, because there's, their corporate memory does revolve, and I think it's probably got more complex, just simply because there are more moving parts. There are more operators in the space. We can see that. I mean, when I sorry, was somebody going to say something?
I was going to say something then. I was going to say, are we talking commercial operators or hobby flyers? Because I know there's no distinction anymore. But
yeah, I mean, well, I went through EuroSC in 2011, and at a time when it wasn't trendy at all to be a drone pilot, and there weren't that many. There were a couple of.
Is it yet? What? Is it moved to be trendy?
Well, all right. It may not be trendy now, but there's a lot more people in it, so there's got to be something attractive to it. And at the time, nobody was really thinking about, right, is this commercially viable? Is this going to be something that we can actually do to make a living? And obviously, a lot of people have followed into the industry. Has it got easier to understand? No. Has it got dramatically more complex? Probably no, but it has got more complex gradually, I think. And actually, what we all want, what I certainly want, is in every part of my life, is a greater level of simplicity.
Yeah,
and because the world is a complex place, and we operate in an industry that operates complex technology. And what you want is a regulator that is able to provide articulate simplistic regulations that can be complied with relatively easily without having to go through the regulatory dance of ringing people, having no email response because they're worried that they're going to put something in writing that will be controversial and may end up looping back and getting them in trouble. And having a conversation where things are implied, but you can't attribute anything to that. And you've got no evidence that even took place, and you get different views from the regulator, from different people, depending on who you speak to. That's quite frustrating, and that is something that seems to have got worse, I think, in the industry. And I'm guessing it's because when we first started out, there was literally one or two people who were involved in drones in the CA, and they were only doing that as a secondary duty because they were involved in general aviation. And their line manager came in one day and said, "Oh, by the way, you're responsible for drones now. You better learn a bit about them." And now we've got, a US sector, we've got innovation hubs and RPAS policy advisors and all sorts, and it's more complex, more moving parts. I'm not quite sure if they're all talking to each other on the same page.
It's no wonder drone registration's going up, eh?
Absolutely.
Well, don't forget, Bruce, that you can fudge those numbers, and you can say there's 500,000 if you're RCA, where they can add the flyer ID and operator ID together to make it look like there's more people flying.
Yeah, but the fees are going up, man. The fees are going up. That's even better.
And then we're going to bump up the fee another quid. Oh, I forgot to.
Jerry Corbett, yeah, remember that?
Yeah, I bet
yeah, because I remember his glove puppet. No, that's Harry Corbett. Anyway,
Jerry Corbett.
something like that.
Sooty and sweep.
That's it.
Yeah.
And Bob Commander was there, and there's a few other people. We flew at Farnborough in 2010 with the guy from the CAA in 2010 arrived in a Spitfire. You want to say how connected they were to industry and flying, and then
that's an interesting observation, Gary, because I know I was talking to a guy in the CAA a while ago, and he said that the using the services of the CAA has become a lot more expensive, because back in the day, everyone in the CAA had a pilot's license. So if you needed a CAA representative on your airfield, he'd jump in a plane and fly down. Now, and he just fly down and then fly back when it's finished, so same day. These days, nobody's got a pilot's license there, so they have to jump on their drive down and stay overnight in a motel, and all that's billable, of course. It's like the people in aviation and the regulators now, it's a job. It is just a job. It's not a passion. It's not a vocation. It's just a job, and that really does have a lot of effects, because people with a passion for something have greater knowledge, depth, understanding. If it's just a job for someone, they'll learn only the minimum they need to perform that task, and that puts them a big gap between the people that do and the people that tell you what to do. And that's where we're seeing a breakdown.
So what So in your safety course, Craig, then I suppose it always has to be, simplify regulations for all aviation, just to make it understandable. Because if you don't understand stuff at a core level without lots and lots of reading and having to commit stuff to memory, then it is kind of pointless. So what do they teach you in that course, if it's anything at all about that?
Well, it's a wide range of things. It's all aspects of safety, air accident investigation, risk in socio-technical environments, quite complex stuff. But anyway, the safety management systems, but there's the things that directly relate here. And I saw a comment earlier by Rowley, who commented about management of risk. And it very much is, regulations is now geared to performance-based oversight and risk-based oversight. And so when it comes to discussions about the bubble and how that affects smaller operators who are operating smaller aircraft in urban environments, you have to remember that there's different strata of users doing different things with different sized drones. And the regulations apply at different levels. And so, I've been part of an organization with an established safety management system operating to the specified, the specific 2 level within SORA to sail 2 levels as well. So that's a pathway that we understand. But then we're operating an aircraft that's 300 to 400 kilograms, and we know what we want to do with it. If you're a smaller operator, you're at the whim of, regulatory changes. So there's a lot of stakeholders, and all of us are trying to find our pathway through a very complex environment, regulatory environment particularly. And
this is, carry on.
No, go on, please.
I was going to say, this is what really annoys me, because regulators talk risk. It's all about risk. Yet they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. We've got a set of regulations that were introduced when drones were being told drones will bring down airliners, drones will do this, that's all so dangerous, drones are all, the drone was vilified. There were so many things, it was just a case of what if, and it's only a matter of time. We'll have had 10 years now, and virtually all those what ifs never happened. There's been not one single death attributed to the recreational use of multi-rotor drones, but the regulations now are even more restrictive than they were back then. So if they're going to be risk-based, you've got to look at the evidence and say, well, we overestimated the risk. We don't need this much restriction, this much control, this much regulation. Let's back it off a bit and let's make the regulation proportionate to risk. Now that we have 10 years of evidence to determine what that risk actually is, instead of being hypothetical, why hasn't that happened?
Bruce, I would just like to say, in the UK, Cap 722, 2002, August. So now in the UK, it's over 20 years, commercial operations. There's never been a death from a drone. So it is all very much overhyped. And while 10 years is when multi-rotors became common, if you like, I would say actually the data point is 20 years, which actually is a far bigger data point. And while there are more being flown now than ever, don't get me wrong, but that's a 20-year datum point they've now got. And you can say for 20 years, no one's been killed by a multi-rotor in the UK or overseas doing commercial or hobby flying. So multi-rotors, the datum at the minute is 20 years, 0. Bizarrely.
Is that how it's worked out, though? Just the fact that it hasn't happened doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Don't get me wrong, right?
But it's a very good indicator. I mean,
it is a good indicator. Yeah, all right. Yeah.
The point I raise is that we know that once every century there is a piece of falling space rock that injures or kills people. We know the frequency because it's happened in Tunguska, it happened at Chelyabinsk, and you're actually at this stage you're more likely to be injured by a piece of falling space junk. In fact, I saw something on the internet the other day. Some paraglider or parachutist, and a meteor, a little piece of rock went shooting past him. It had fallen from space. If it had been a few feet over, it would have hit him and killed him. This is how dangerous falling space rock is, but we have no regulations to protect us from falling space rock.
You see, now if the AAIB had a drone done that, they would say no overflight and the drone was too close, this and the other. But a meteor falling out of the sky happens and it happens more than once, doesn't it, Bruce? Let's be honest.
I'm talking about but major sort of damage and injury causing events.
I mean, let's face it, there was that meteor that came down in Russia, wasn't there? It came over that city. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was Chelyabinsk.
That big one. I mean,
almost a century after Tunguska, which was exactly the same thing. And so we've got a cycle once every century that happens. And in the case of Chelyabinsk, over 1,000 people were hospitalized with injuries mainly caused by broken glass from the shockwave. So why don't we, since we know this is a definite thing, it's not a what if, it's not only a matter of time because it's happened twice, why don't we have rules that say all windows must be shatterproof glass? That would save people from injury.
Yeah.
Yes. Who do we send the fine to? Well,
Gary's always willing to pay a fine.
No, send them to me. No, yes, I see where you're going with that one there, Geeks. I see where you're going, Sean.
I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, right? And it'll be sad the day it does happen. When a drone finally does fall out of the sky and it does the unfortunate thing, it'll be a sad day. But then and the harsh thing is, the harsh reality becomes we then have a data point as well.
At the moment we get divided by zero errors when we try and work out the ratio of unmanned or recreational flights versus manned aviation deaths. The calculator keeps erroring out, but once you have one death, you can establish a ratio.
Yeah,
and we've had another 2 fatals over this last weekend down here. I say I daren't have a counter for the number of GA deaths around the world because I just think that's a bit ghoulish. But
it's over.
It's what are we now? This 18th, and it's already beginning to become
it's over 100.
Meaningful.
Yeah, with that Nepal crash, that's put a big bump in it.
Well, I'd keep that one out because that's professional aviation.
Still manned aviation, though.
Out.
Still manned aviation. It's still forced. Unmanned is always going to be safer than manned.
That's a stat I learned recently in my previous organisations that we were trying to put together a case for doing crop spraying in North America, and we learned that in the joint stats for the deaths of pilots flying crop spraying aircraft between basically Canada and the United States amounted to 17 pilots a year who were being killed in crop spraying accidents.
Wow.
And yet that's a stat that we had to root that out, you know, through a freedom of information equivalent type request. And just so that we could understand how we could apply a business case in that sense. But nobody's talking about those sort of stats. If, however, there was a crop spraying drone that was flying and fell out of the sky and landed on a single person, and that person was injured or killed, then that would be front page news.
So that's a good way to bringing it around to what we should be saying is, well, who should be educating the public and regulators? Is it down to each and every one of us, or should our organizations that say they represent us be standing up and doing a little bit more, especially those organizations that take a fee to represent the community?
At least we have the BMFA and FPV UK. Let's face it, the BMFA does a brilliant job of hobby flyers, getting people into hobbies. They do a great job. The BMFA is fantastic. There was that thing that came up a second ago about hobby flying in the UK, a number of accidents. There's been about 6 since 1940. There's been about 6. In the UK since 1940 something. So if you wanted to include the hobby ones, there's about 6, I think it is, sadly. But that's over nearly 100 years now. So again, it has happened, and it's sad.
You probably find more people died on the drive to the flying field in that period of time.
Yes. Yeah, and more people have died crossing the street, or you got in your car, went for a drive.
Especially around where Gary drives.
Definitely. Because I'm driving down the street, exactly.
So I sent you that link, Gary, of the falling meteorite. Did you see that? There's a frame.
Standby caller.
Yep. People might want to see that. It's actually quite interesting. And it shows how, as I say, falling space rock is a bigger danger than falling drones.
Well, there is thousands of them around the globe every day, isn't it? So,
yeah.
Oh, hello, universe today. This is a bit of a video. Is that it going past?
Yeah, several frames from the video. So there's actually on YouTube, there's a video of it. And but it's only caught in a number of frames because it's moving so fast. So look, imagine if that had been just a couple of meters over, it could have hit and at that speed, the piece of rock that size, it would have probably done you a severe injury, if not killed you.
No, he should have to report that, shouldn't he? Really?
Yeah, it might have been a drone. Well, a granite drone.
That's amazing. That is amazing. And of course, well, then that brings us back round to the if no one had a video of it, would it have been a thing, which we mentioned with the hurricane? Because if you didn't have a camera 20 years ago, if you didn't have a GoPro, well, that didn't happen then.
Anything that can happen will happen, but it's no reason to be worried about it. If the probability is so low, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. If the probability is near zero, the risk is near zero because it's it's a product of two factors. So if any one of those factors is extremely small, the outcome will always be extremely small.
I find that an interesting comment from Rowley there. Drones can't carry enough water to fight fire. It's not a viable option.
They can carry enough batteries to start them.
Exactly. and you know where it is, the GPS location and everything. That's something like the Cam and K Max. I think I don't agree with you. I would agree that nobody's properly done it.
I've seen aircraft that are being designed for that with a 200 kilogram water payload. Now, 200 kilograms is not anywhere near the sort of, these flying boats that land on lakes and then fill up, a massive amount of water in their hull and then they take off and go off to the fire. I agree. But if you've got lots more of these unmanned aircraft systems that can carry 200 kilograms and you can operate them in a coordinated way,
you need a UTM for that.
Ardent around, then they can be quite effective.
We have they use the crop dusters here for it, and when they come, the thing with that is the turnaround time. We've got loads of dams. I live on a dam. There's loads of dams around here. So if you had something that could land on and top itself up, it would soon beat the crop duster because the crop duster is going to go all the way back down to Howick to get filled up again, and then come all the way back again. So
that's why those firefighting boats have those. They can just, like the float planes, they can land and suck up the water as they're going along the water, and you've got helicopters with buckets they can refill quickly. That is the turnaround time is the thing, isn't it?
Well, yeah, Dan mentioned the singular aircraft flyox, but do we know if that's actually flown in that role and done that? I know they've sold them, and there's been loads of renders, and there's been loads of pictures of people stood by them and saying strong words about just how good they are, but I'm not. Have we actually seen one of those in operation anywhere? I'm not sure they have yet. They're big. They are big. There's a couple in Kenya, but anyway. So, are you from a farm crop spraying drones now, Craig? Maybe, well, maybe you can't say what you are now. Well,
hot air water balloons. That's what you need. Hot air water balloons.
No, I'm not involved in crop spraying. Put it that way.
No, but he's been involved in all sorts of big things. Now, look, I'm going to have to go because my power is going to go out soon. So let's run through. So, what's the takeaway from that? You should beginning, middle, and end, as I tell children when they're writing stories at school. So, what's the end of that? The regulations are too difficult. Is that the end? Is that how we sum that up?
That's the takeaway that I get.
Simplicity.
Falling levels of compliance.
I know. What's this one say? Drones at Speedway. I fly somewhere. Well, yeah, but the risk. I think that thing in the Thames. The idea of returning home with 15% of battery, it's just ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. That's giving you absolutely no leeway at all. So where am I taking that? I'm taking that to planning and preparation, prevent pretty poor performance, or plan the flight and fly.
Maybe
plan,
they should
all those other things.
Test these commercial drone pilots for their actual ability, rather than what the the little thesis they can write to get the necessary permissions.
I wonder if it was one of those where it was like, I can squeeze one more flight in, where you have the human factors.
Exactly, human factors.
One more flight. I can get that one more flight.
Both of those instances, because that battery and some of the other batteries in that, I've forgotten the name of it, where you slotted in, already looked a little bit poked, and that's turning around and going. So that's pressure in an operational sort of a way, a search and rescue emergency way, and then the other pressure was commercial pressure over the boat race. Yeah. So that's both human factors or human,
and all because they didn't have skin in the game, eh?
And here's the thing: the Free Fly Alter, if I remember correctly, I've flown one. If I remember correctly, a few years ago, if I remember correctly, you can hot swap the batteries, so you don't have to power the whole system down. You can literally just whip one off, put one on, whip the other one off, connect the other one, and it stays alive. So therefore, you wouldn't have to wait for it to reboot the entire flight controller, everything. It just, and it's home.
Now, is that a valid? It really depends on how far away from home he was.
If you have to stage live,
you'll get back easy. Is that a way we should be talking in aviation? Yeah, you'll get back easy.
No, because if you have to punch something, if you have an emergency, you want to punch that.
Is that a valid? It really depends on how far away from home he was.
It's not me. I'm muted.
In the past. Is that a way we should be talking in aviation? Yeah, you'll get back easy.
No, because if you have to.
It's Craig.
Well, no, because saying, it's only 100 yards away. If he had to divert or he has to punch the aircraft just to get it out of the way of someone or something in an emergency, that power just gets sucked so quickly. You've got no reserve to protect everyone around you, and you're not going to make it back home safely. So there's just swapping the batteries would have saved the day, and for literally a 30-second job, it should have just done.
Because no pilot's ever run out of fuel, eh?
Yeah,
no.
Exactly.
No.
Well, Bruce, I should think you're the same. You've been down the model flying field. You go, one more flight.
You never have a last flight.
How fatal is that?
I've known 2 people that have died on the last flight of the day.
While we're talking safety, before I forget, here in New Zealand, there was a mailing list operated by the military because they do some planned low-level flights, right? So they had a mailing list, which I subscribed to, which allowed you to be advised in advance of when they were going to do some low-level flying in your area. That was great because I actually changed a few of my flying plans on the basis of there could be some Trojans or some AT6s or whatever coming through at 500 feet, and they may have barometric, it may have been 400 feet. You don't know. So I avoided flying in areas on those days when there were those planned missions. Now, the New Zealand aviation industry now has crowed about, we've got this new system, it's called Flight Advisor, and it's fantastic, and it's going to deconflict the low-level airspace. The problem is they've discontinued the mailing list, and you can only get access to Flight Advisor if you have a pilot's license. So the people who are most benefiting from this sub 500 foot activity advice, the unmanned aviation community, do not have access to the data that it's creating. What the hell are they doing? They spend all this money to create a service which is inaccessible to the people who could most benefit from it in terms of making sure they're not there when these planes come through.
Well, that sort of speaks to, again, back to modern technology, being able to take up some of the slack. We've got all this gear. We should really start using it or rolling it out in a more effective manner. It's a digital sky now. Come on, people. Let's fly in the digital sky and let's share it equitably.
No, manned aviation's analog.
Well, quite so. And complacency, as Squishy says, complacency kills. But it'll be all right. Oh, it's not very far. Oh, God, I'm just going to sound like the oldest person in the world. But it's not. It's not a good idea. The only time you've got too much fuel is when you're on fire. Otherwise, you've never got enough fuel. And it just blows my mind that I don't know, Craig. Would you fly home with 15% in the battery? Would that be your?
Not personally, no. To my mind, there are 2 ways you approach this. You set technology limits, which mean that the system would not allow that to happen. There'd be a higher threshold, but more importantly, you set a procedural operational limit that is built into the day-to-day operation of the pilots and the basic processes that underpin operation. 15% is nowhere near enough.
Interesting thing, though, it boils down again to having the experience, knowledge, and understanding of the craft you're flying. Because if you've got a craft that flies for an hour, and 15% of that is quite a few minutes of flight time left, and it may give you more than enough time to come back. Maybe able to transit backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times. Whereas other craft, 15% of the battery may be way too low. You need to be aware. You can't make a rule for this because it's the responsibility of the operator to know their craft well enough to set really safe margins for operation. In this case, obviously they didn't. No amount of regulation could have fixed that.
Yeah, it's and So I don't know if when you did the Euro C course, Craig, but when I did it, they were saying,
I don't like to mention that word on here. That's a bit of a swear word. That.
Sorry. But they were telling us like 10% is fine with a LiPo battery. And there was myself and another guy called Andrew who was in the same thing as me, and we're both hobby flyers. We were like 10%, not even 15%. You know, you want to be 20% when you think about it. My battery warnings on all my drones is set at 30%. Now, 30% is my first warning. That tells me my battery is getting down. I am always, wherever I can, landing around 20% or just under. And I mean like 18%. I do not push my batteries down to 15% because what happens with all batteries is eventually they start to wear out and you'll suddenly get a drop off in that last bit. So I try to look after them a little bit. So 30%, and I'm landing at 20%. That's my basic standard flying rule for me.
That's the other thing too, because these rules might have been made by people who are used to petrol-powered planes or fuel-powered aircraft, which actually perform best of all on the last drops of fuel because they're lighter. But with batteries, as they get to the last 15%, you just do not have the current reserve to provide the level of performance you get with a full battery, but it weighs just as much. So the performance curves are radically different between an electric-powered craft and a fuel-powered craft. And if you're just sitting in an office working from a book, you probably don't even know that.
Especially if you need to punch out for any reason. If you're coming into land and all of a sudden someone encroaches and you have to punch that aircraft.
If you want to do some flips and rolls, I mean, you're buggered.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it will just, the thing is, you get that current draw because you'll punch it to push it away fast and hard. And as it does that, the current draw drops, your safety kicks in. Before you know it, you've got another problem because all your safety on the aircraft has kicked in and gone, battery voltage too low. I'm now going to land, and then you've got another problem you don't need. It's just, it just compounds your issues.
So I think then as a group, in this group therapy, we've come around to thinking that 15% coming home is not probably the best thing to do.
It's going to ruin the life of your batteries.
Of how many.
They don't like being discharged that low. I never take mine. You're generally below 25, 30% because that last few percent.
I'm on the ground at 30. I'm definitely on the ground at 30. I never go below 30. I consider that to be my. I'm coming home at 50, and I'm on the ground at 30. But maybe I'm too conservative.
No, but any operator,
if you want to operate successfully and you've only got 3 batteries and you're stretching it all just to make it all, or 4, I think it was in that case, 4 in that other thing. And you're stretching it, you're giving yourself human factors problems just by the number of batteries you've got, your flight time, and the money you've got to earn, and I don't know. I would rather regulators spent a little bit more time addressing that sort of problem than coming up with crazy rules about cylinders and cones and bubbles and the stuff that actually matters. Anyway, I ranted a bit then. No, I did say I was going because I've got to go because my power's going out soon. There we go. Well, thanks, Dan. I just saying that I felt like I was the oldest person in the world, and not that I am, and I'm too much of a duff up. But anyway, I must go because the lights are going to go out. So, dear viewer, wherever you are in the world, look after yourselves. Don't fly below 30%, and we'll see you again 2100 GMT when we'll get ourselves closer to when that chap's going to get himself prosecuted. So it'll be interesting to see that. Go home. Yeah, I know. Take care, everybody. There's one button. There's 2. Cheers.